Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So we're very excited to have a conversation about ageism. Not excited about ageism, but excited to talk about ageism. I just want to remind you that we'll take a few questions at the end of this session, and all of you should be familiar now with Slido, so feel free to go ahead and enter those, and we'll take those in just a few minutes. I want to start off with Dr. Karl Pillemer, who is a professor of ecology at Cornell University. You've spent a lot of your career and professional life looking at the consequences of ageism, not just in a social way, but actually real, tangible health effects of age discrimination. Talk about that.
But one of the famous anecdotes is a 97-year-old who goes in with problems in his left knee, and the doctor says, "So what do you expect? You're 97. And he says, "Well, my right knee is also 97. And these are the false expectations that we have about aging. I'll say the notion of ageism may seem to be a trivial problem, one that shows up in late-night talk show jokes about politicians who are older or tacky birthday cards, but it has very serious health consequences. Research shows that older people who have more negative attitudes towards their own aging have poor mental and physical health and higher mortality. It's also true that ageism affects our society in general by keeping older people from meaningful roles. But finally, it's very damaging also to young people as we enter into an aging world. Growing up and living with negative stereotypes, false beliefs, and prejudices really harms everyone. And almost all of those old people, if lucky, are going to be old themselves. So it's creating a negative atmosphere for each and every one of them.
Well, to this point, aging is not the same for everyone, and the discrimination that people might face is also not the same. Michelle, you work at John Jay, and you have worked in the past as a labor economist. Yeah. Talk to me about the differential effects that aging has on different populations, whether it's race or different generations.
And gender as well. So I am a labor economist, and I look at how different groups fare in the American workforce. And so where ageism intersects with what I do is that what I found, for example, I worked for a nonprofit anti-poverty organization for about 4 years before I started at John Jay, and I was their senior labor market analyst. And what I found that when during the recovery from the Great Recession, it was really older women of color who had a harder time rebounding in the New York City workforce. And so what was happening is that different isms were intersecting: ageism, racism to some degree, and also issues that women particularly face in the workforce. And so one of the things I like to emphasize is that in order to combat isms, whether it be ageism, the gender wage gap, the racial wage gap, access to information is key. And one of the things about the American culture is we don't talk about pay. We don't talk about earnings because it's associated with status. But in fact, most of the legal suits regarding the gender wage gap have been as a result of women finding out, right, that another member, a male colleague is making more than them. So one of the things that I like to emphasize is we have to talk to each other, particularly those of us in groups that tend not to be favored in the workforce, women, people of color, older workers, in order to combat these isms that do happen, particularly in economic downturns when marginalized groups become a little more vulnerable.
Stephen, in your work as a journalist and an author, you've spent much of your time chronicling the experiences of the LGBT community. And I wonder what you found about the distinctive experiences that those people might have as they age.
So that is something I've been writing about, and it really came home to me, not as a journalist, but as a person, about 3 years ago. My parents died within a 3-month window, and my husband and I separated in the middle of that window. And he left me, by the way. And suddenly that really gave me a great deal of empathy for the statistics that I knew about LGBTQ people and how they age. There's a stereotype that that gays are wealthy. Well, they're not, and lesbians especially are 2 times more likely to fall under the poverty line. There's a great deal of discrimination, and especially when you start looking at some of these assisted living homes. People often feel like they're having to go back into the closet. They can't be themselves after a lifetime of this, and so that's very challenging. And then access to services and care. Many of us, myself included in this, do not have children. Now I don't have the husband. I love my nieces very much, and so I think this really points to the fact that when we're talking about aging, one size does not fit all, and that we really need to kind of break it down to see how different sectors really fare and the specific challenges that they face.
Absolutely. I'm sitting on stage a little self-conscious about my own age since we are talking about it. And what's coming to mind particularly is a meme that has circulated in recent weeks. Okay, boomer, online. These millennials or Gen Z will basically respond to anything that someone from the baby boomer generation says dismissively. Okay, boomer, you ruined America. Okay, boomer. And to me, this is important to bring up because it encapsulates this kind of generational warfare that for some reason culturally we've seemed to have, especially in recent years. And I wonder, Karl, based on your work gathering the stories of America's aging population, what you make of this warfare that seems to be happening.
That raises an incredibly good point, because there are 2 things about aging, or things which make old people, if they are different. One is developmentally, so how we all change over the course of the lifespan, that we get older, we get gray hair, that we lose our hair, so we're identifiably older. But, well, I am losing my hair, not everyone here on this panel is, but and also, though, there is the historical cohort in which people grow up, which also shapes their lives. So the point you make is incredibly important. Old people aren't just old people any more than you can say Asians encompass Koreans, people who are Japanese and who are Chinese. Each cohort is different. And that's what you're experiencing in the kind of generational warfare. It's a combination of people's aging process, but also a hostility towards that generation, which was not experienced towards the so-called greatest generation, where they were sort of revered. I think we need to try to avoid that if at all possible, because of all the other divisions in society. Generational divisions like that are really problematic. But I would agree with you. You see it a lot now in popular culture. And it's difficult to know how to put that particular genie back in the bottle.
I think it's especially challenging because so much of that is political. It comes up in conversations about political candidates. We've seen that only in the last few weeks with Bernie Sanders having a heart attack and people openly questioning whether he might be fit for office. And I wonder, Michelle, you're someone who thinks a lot about the workforce and who should be in what roles in the workforce. And obviously, president is not a job that most of us will be auditioning for in our lifetimes. Yeah. But I wonder how you've been hearing this conversation that's been going on politically about age and who should lead the country based on their age.
Yeah, so I considered myself someone, and maybe this is wishful thinking, but somewhere in between, a tweener, at the end, kind of the baby boom generation. And so I don't particularly feel, at least when I talk to my nieces, my nephews, younger folks that I know that I work with, that there's this friction in terms of politically. I do think, and it's just a symptom of young folks, is they always think they're smarter, and they don't recognize that what they're doing, we did the same thing, and what they've done, we've done, and probably better. But I don't think that I don't necessarily agree that we're at odds so much as that we, as either older or middle-aged, we recognize what the young folks are thinking, are feeling about us, because we were there. Let's face it, we were there. And so I think, we're in a better position to deal with this friction than they are, because we know it's kind of a false dichotomy. Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll open that question up a little bit. What's the right way to have a conversation like this in our public life, where it's okay to bring up factors like health, having a heart attack as being part of fitness for office, but that we're not porting in stereotypes and all of these negative messages about what it means to be an older person in America?
Well, one point I wanted to make was that there's a very big difference between being older and being ill. Mm-hmm. And Senator Sanders had a heart attack, and that is an illness. That is separate from, from his age, but we conflate them. And I get troubled actually by using the word old, this kind of bucket that we sort of put everybody in. And as part of the research that I've been doing for a new book, it used to be that we sort of went by this one standard called chronological age, and basically at 60 or 65, you were old. I always thought like on the morning of my 60th birthday, everything was going to change, and that would be that. But that led to some huge discrepancies around the world, because in Japan, people will live longer, and in Africa, less. And even in this country, there are those differentials. So, so when we talk about who is old, we don't really have a grip on that. And, and the definition I sort of prefer to use these days is when illness starts to impact your quality of life. And that's much more specific, and I think, and more respectful.
Karl, what would you add?
Well, I absolutely agree, and we have this conflation of aging and disease, and we're very bad at predicting how any individual is going to do over the course of later life, so I think that's true. I wanted to add, I think that's fueled by what I think is an immensely dangerous experiment in our society, and that's the extraordinary segregation by age, that we've become one of the most age-segregated societies that's existed. Most young people have no contact with older people outside of intermittent events in their own family. And if you don't believe me, I ask you to show me the 27-year-old who last week had pals over for pizza and beer and invited his 82-year-old friend. It's so unusual, it seems peculiar. Most people are more likely to have a close friend of a different race, a close personal friend, than they are to have a close personal friend who's 10 years older or 10 years younger. So I think a lot of the problems you're identifying are also potentiated by informal age segregation that's getting worse and worse. And that's another genie that's hard to put back in the bottle.
You've been doing research with the World Health Organization on ageism. And I think it's remarkable that the WHO, this big international body that cares about health, has actually identified ageism as a health risk, a health danger. Talk about some of what you found in that research and potentially things that could be done to combat ageism.
Yeah, briefly, ageism is harmful to the health of people age 50 and beyond in various ways. First of all, studies show, and even though they're great people, and some of my best friends are there, there's lots of ageism in healthcare. Older people are excluded from clinical trials or experimental treatment sometimes, but they may not be offered treatment, say, for depression, because a clinician may think most old people are depressed. That's one reason why the World Health Organization has gotten into it. It's also the findings I mentioned earlier that people who are like other groups who might experience discrimination, people who experience or exposed to a lot of ageism do worse, not just in mental health, but in physical health. And it's very difficult internationally, where there are even legal systems that mandate early forced retirement, or that have other very aversive laws towards older people. So that, yes, if you go to the WHO website, it's fascinating to see their interest in it.
Can I just add on one thing to that? We talk about other problems, racism, sexism, for instance, and there are often public campaigns to try to change attitudes, to normalize them. There are very few, if any, in this country that talk about ageism. And so we have these views, and many of them are incorrect. And I think what we need to do is to start telling more stories of different kinds of people from the groups that we're talking about, to kind of bridge those gaps that we live with.
Yeah, Michelle, give us the 30,000-foot view. What is the consequence of all of this ultimately for how people age in the United States?
So one of the things I wanted to make sure I talked about, Emma, is that, with ageism, the implications are not the same for everyone. And so for women, particularly, and for people of color, one of the things we have to think about, and again, I'm coming from an economist perspective, is that our attachment and involvement to the workforce is not the same as for men or for whites. And so when we're thinking about becoming older workers and what that means as women and or people of color and or LGBTQ, we've got to recognize that given the gender wage gap, we don't have the same savings, we don't have the same wealth, we don't have the same amount in our 401ks. Being a person of color, the racial wage gap, higher unemployment rates, being a woman, lower labor force participation rates, all of that really means is that we are at a disadvantage when it comes to planning for our future, particularly for retirement. And so I know the discourse around retirement in this country has been about you don't have enough, but especially for women and people of color, we've got to pay attention to that because of the issues regarding the gender wage gap, the racial wage gap, the wealth gap, higher unemployment. That all affects our planning for the future in a really startling way. So I wanted to raise that as a point.
Absolutely. So we're going to turn to audience questions. We have one from the audience about loneliness, which has been deemed an epidemic. Are older groups feeling loneliness disproportionately because of ageism, Karl?
The changing family structure has really contributed to that. It's true that loneliness and social isolation, perhaps saying epidemic proportions is a little high, but the baby boom generations entering an old age, much more likely to be in intact marriages, and their parents in particular were very likely to enter old age with lots of kids and in intact marriages. The boomer generation is much more likely not to have that, and the same is going to continue. So a lot of the informal support of the community ties, which older people used to have really been compromised. And there are very serious health consequences. So a public health approach to a loneliness, and I think again you see the same kind of double and triple jeopardy that you're talking about, of people who don't have access to transportation, whose own communities may have been disrupted. So for poor people and people of color, those loneliness and isolation, despite our stereotypes about these warm communities, are even more acute. It's a huge issue that's going to come up over the next 10 years.
Wow. Another question for Stephen. Your upcoming book talks about things that you're going to do as you age that your parents didn't do. Give a few examples.
So that book is called Stupid Things I Won't Do When I'm Old. And I spent a good period of time when my parents were ill chronicling and writing about their illnesses. And every once in a while, my mother would read one of them and she'd say, "Oh, that sounds just like me." And I said, "Yeah, Mom, that is you." But I sort of, in both a loving and a professional way, I looked at the various decisions they made over time. And my dad was a very proud, independent, stubborn person, and he refused to get a walker. And he kept falling, and as most of us know, falls can be fatal, and it wound up being a fall that took his life. So I've kind of put together a list of the things that I will and I won't do. I'm going to try to stay kind. I'm going to try to stay well groomed. I'm going to hope that my pants never sort of ride way up.
Great socks, though.
Thank you. And some of them are substantive, but it really goes back to Karl's point about the stereotypes and the impact of these negative stereotypes on older people and how they hurt us and the perceptions around us. And so I think if we can own more of those stereotypes and change what we can, we'll be happier and we'll be more integrated into our worlds.
Michelle, you spoke about actually experiencing relative harmony with people in your multi-generational family communities relationships, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
And we have a question from a millennial in the audience who maybe hasn't had that experience, who wants to know how he or she can be a better ally to older generations. What would you advise?
So one of the things I would probably advise is to kind of find out what are some of the challenges being faced by the elders in your community. I live in Harlem, and there's a huge elderly and older community in Harlem. And so, I don't actually see, as you would probably agree with, a lot of interaction between younger folks and older folks in my community. In my family, it's a little bit different, but part of that is because I have Caribbean roots. And so in terms of the Caribbean community, elders, younger folk, it's just all intergenerational. And so I would say just kind of, figure out not just what older people in general face, because you can get on the AARP website and find out what are the pressing policy issues facing older Americans, but, talk to people in your community for more specificities in terms of what they face, which ties right into what you said about if you live in a community where there's no transportation and you're older, how do you get around? How, do you navigate those spaces that you live in? And so I would say just reach out to elders in your community.
That's a great place to stop. We have to close up. Thank our panelists. Thank you so much.